Hey everybody, so today we're going to be diving into the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown. Because if you've seen a child have a tantrum or a meltdown, they kind of look very similar, and sometimes it's hard to tell them apart. So in today's video, we're going to be diving into the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown and how to treat those differences if your child is having one. So let's start off with tantrums. Tantrums are typically goal-driven. That means that your child is typically behaving in a certain type of way in order to A, get something that they want, or to avoid doing something that they're being asked to do. So for example, if your child is begging you for ice cream and you tell them no, and then all of a sudden you hear the screaming, you see the kicking, the throwing, and the full blown on like fit on the floor, that is a tantrum because they wanted something and you said no, you can't have it, and that resulted in the tantrum. Now if your child is trying to get out of doing something, let's just say it's time for them to leave the park but they don't want to, that could also resort into a tantrum because you're asking them to do something that they don't necessarily want to do, and so the tantrum kicks in. And the reason why they're having this tantrum is because in their little bodies and in their little minds, they have programmed themselves to believe, hey, if I exhibit I'm gonna put my foot down, and if I yell and I kick and I throw, eventually mom or dad is gonna give in. So basically you have to remember that tantrums are all about control and communication. When a child throws a tantrum, they are basically testing their boundaries and expressing their frustration. But here's the key. During a tantrum, a child still has some level of awareness. Usually when a child throws a tantrum, they are keeping their eye on you to make sure that you are watching them, because they typically want some type of response or reaction out of you. And so typically the tantrum will stop if you give in to what they want, which I don't recommend, and we'll get into that in just a few. But if you give in to what they want, typically the tantrum is going to stop. Or if they realize like they're not going to get their way no matter how much they yell and kick and scream, then the tantrum will typically stop. Now let's flip the script and talk about a meltdown. Now a meltdown is not goal-oriented, unlike the tantrum. When a child is having a meltdown, they're not necessarily trying to control you or manipulate you to get something that they want. Typically, a meltdown is caused by them having some type of emotional or sensory overload. So think of a meltdown as a situation in which the child's brain just cannot process any more information. So a child may be overwhelmed because there may be too many lights on, or too much noises, or too loud of a noise, or the crowd is too much, or there's too many people around them, or they're just feeling anxious or overwhelmed in like a public setting. So a meltdown is a result of typically those big emotions because the child just cannot control their environment, and the way that their brain is processing information, it does not align with the environment around them, and it's often way too much for them. So just as a recap, let me give you 3 brief ways to remember the differences between a tantrum and a meltdown. Number 1, tantrums are typically goal-oriented. Remember, the child usually wants something and they know exactly what they're doing. Number 2, remember that meltdowns are unintentional. When it comes to a meltdown, the child usually is not aware of their behavior, and they usually just can't snap out of it. Remember, meltdowns are typically caused by being overwhelmed, either emotionally or rather due to a sensory overload. Key number 3 to remember is that tantrums usually stop when the child gets their way or when they realize their tantrum is not working. But on the flip side, a meltdown does not typically stop until the child has an opportunity to calm and reset. So now that you know the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown, let's talk about strategies for handling both of these situations. So tip number 1 when it comes to handling a tantrum is to remember, as the parent, the caregiver, the teacher, the therapist, is for you to stay as calm as possible. And I know that is way easier said than done. But remember, your reaction can either fuel the situation or defuse the situation. So remember to keep your voice calm and avoid engaging in a power struggle, because that just makes it worse for the both of you. Also, tip number 2 when it comes to handling a tantrum is to set clear boundaries. So if you told them already that the answer is no, remember, stick to it, right? Because if you say no, but then the child throws a tantrum and then you give in to their tantrum, that's just a learned behavior that now they understand, like, oh, now all I have to do is throw a fit and I'm gonna get my way. And if you're like, oops, I messed up, remember, next time, stick to your guns, because if you don't, the child's tantrums are just gonna keep getting worse and worse because they're gonna think and expect for you to give in to them. So remember, set those clear expectations and those clear boundaries from the jump and stick to your guns. Tip number 3 is to offer choices to them. So sometimes offering choices can decrease and diffuse the situation. So let's say, for example, your child starts to throw a tantrum because you told them it's gonna be time to leave the park soon, okay? And they're having this tantrum because they don't wanna leave the park. So in order to diffuse the situation, you can give them 2 choices. So you can say, for example, when we leave the park and go home, would you like to play a game or would you like to watch a movie, right? And hopefully they're able to pick one of the 2, right? So that way they can kind of snap out of it and be like, oh, well, when I leave, I get to go play a fun game, or when I leave, I get to go watch a fun movie. But obviously that may not always work, but sometimes giving those 2 choices may actually decrease the big tantrum that that child is having. So I recommend to try that strategy out. And tip number 4, if the child is throwing a tantrum, remember to ignore the attention-seeking behavior, because sometimes kids will throw things, or they'll kick, or they'll hit, or they'll do something to try to get a reaction and a response out of you, right? And so what you want to do is ignore the behavior, but tune into whatever it is that the child is trying to get your attention for. And sometimes you may have to just tune out the behavior, especially if you know that that child is safe, you have your eye on them, but you're not looking directly at them, then you may need to just pretend like you're scrolling on your phone or do something else to diffuse you giving that attention to that child in that particular moment. And sometimes that will help diffuse the situation as well, because the child will look at you and realize you're not giving them that reaction that they were hoping for, so they might just move on to something else. So now let's move on to a few quick strategies to manage meltdowns. So tip number 1 is to create a calming environment. You may need to remove any triggers if possible. So you may need to dim the lights, you may need to move to a quieter space, you may need to move to a smaller space with less people, and that may be the way to help manage that meltdown. Tip number 2 is to follow the child's lead on what feels right for them. So if your child is having a meltdown, let's just say they're in a crowded space and it's way too much for them. You may have a child that really calms when you give them comfort and give them a hug, or you may have a child that just needs some time and some space. So really try to monitor what works best for your child and follow their lead and support them in whatever is going to help them reset and calm. Which leads me to tip number 3, which is to use some type of calming technique. So different techniques work for different children. So you'll have to just kind of play around and see what works best for your child. So some children may calm if you give them a weighted object to hold. Some children may calm if you give them a tight hug. Some children may calm if you give them some sensory fidget. Some children may calm if you give them a little snack and a drink of water. Some children may calm if you coach them through taking some deep breaths. So find out what works best for your child and implement those strategies if you see that they are having a meltdown. And tip number 4, if your child is having a meltdown, is to be patient. Sometimes working through a meltdown can take an extended amount of time, because just remember, your child has all this buildup and buildup and buildup of emotion, and now it's just physically coming out and presenting itself into behaviors that may seem inappropriate at the moment. So it may take them a little bit of time to settle down. So you have to remember to just be patient and let your child work through it, and you support them as much as you can. So remember, it's super important that you understand the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown, because it's going to depict what strategies that you use to help your child remove themselves from whatever situation that is going on. It's going to impact how you address your child, right? So if your child is having a tantrum because they're not getting their way, you're going to treat that situation completely different if you have a child that's just having a meltdown because it's too much sensory overload coming in. So that's why it's so important that you understand the difference. Now, if you have a child that tends to throw a tantrum out in public and it's like so embarrassing, you like want to crawl into a shell like a turtle, I want you to stay tuned and watch this next video on how to not feel embarrassed when your child throws a tantrum in public. All right guys, till next time, bye.